if we claim to care about the vulnerable, about the marginalized, about helping those in need, that was the big headline, then how can we be silent? How can we be silent about the wholesale destruction of infants in the womb?
Hello and welcome back to the Brephos podcast, the UK's only podcast dedicated to dealing with abortion in the UK context. And this week on the show, we're going to be looking at the Evangelical Alliance's recent report on thinking faithfully about politics. Helping me to digest and drill down on the most important aspects of this report is Tim Lewis from Harrogate. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Christian. Good to see you, brother.
Great to have you back, and thank you so much for highlighting this report. Just give us a bit of background. What is this report? Why should we pay attention to it?
Yeah, well, I think, as you say, Christian, I think we can really be really grateful to the EA for this piece of research. It's a really helpful tool. Not a perfect tool, but it's a helpful indication. So it's called Thinking Faithfully About Politics, as you've said, and it's subtitled "A Snapshot of How Evangelicals Think and Act as They Engage in Politics." And that's really what it does. It looks at a series of questions. They asked just under 1,400 self-described evangelicals. So it's a decent number of people. It's a decent survey. And I think, just very briefly, in terms of the headlines that the EA themselves pull out, they suggest that the key headline from the report is that 6 out of 10 UK evangelicals believe politics should be motivated by helping those most in need. That should be the kind of driving factor. And additionally, the report shows UK evangelicals are highly engaged with politics, want to see biblical principles demonstrated in politics, and perhaps most interestingly, I think, certainly from our point of view, want a role for the church in politics. So a massive 70% think the church should not be confined to just preaching the gospel, but should have a role in politics. Mm-hmm. And even more, 93%, so pretty much all UK and evangelicals who took part in this survey, want to see more Christians engaged in politics. That means standing for parliament, taking part in local politics, all the rest of it. So there's some of the headlines. And I would say those findings, those kind of headline findings, are really encouraging to us. And they reflect desires, certainly on this podcast, frequently voiced, that Christians would become more politically engaged and would kind of get involved in our nation on a local and national level. So I think the headlines are good. The headlines are encouraging. When you work through the details, Christian, when you read the whole report, it's only 28 pages or so it's not a massive time. But when you actually look at some of the fine grain, the situation does become more complex, arguably not quite as encouraging, and certainly I would say pretty inconsistent across the piece.
Okay, so if there was an election called tomorrow, who would win, according to this report?
According to this report, in a word, Labour. So the statistics on that are 42% of these respondents, of these UK evangelicals, would vote for Labour, which is actually, this is where it's interesting, that's greater than the general population. So it's 41% in the general population whenever this was done.
And I also saw in a breakdown of one of the things, they said that more women would vote for Labour than men. Can you explain that phenomenon?
No, I've sort of I skipped over that bit of the sort of gender breakdown. It was quite, because actually what that gender breakdown said, that more women would vote for all of the parties save the Conservatives than the male respondents in this thing. It was quite unique. I'm not sure what there is to say about that, really. Just very briefly though, on the kind of the sort of party political split. So 42% said they'd vote for Labour, so obviously Labour would win on that basis. 29% for the Conservatives, which is actually still higher than the general population. So the general population, it's only 24% say they're going to vote Conservative, less than a quarter. So those two big parties count for 70% of the evangelical vote. Okay, and if you include the Lib Dems, who are obviously not going to win at all, but if you include them, it's 86%. And again, only 13% of the general population saying they're voting for Lib Dems. So general population are voting in greater numbers, Christian, for these smaller parties, whether that's Green, whether that's Reform UK. There was nothing really on parties like SNP, Plaid, DUP. I'm not sure whether they were included. But the big picture is that evangelicals are somewhat more conformist in party political terms than the general population. And then the other really big finding, of course, is that there's a clear preference for Labour among evangelicals, which may simply be reflective of, is this fatigue we've had over a decade of the Conservatives, or is it indicative? This is perhaps a more interesting question. Is it indicative of more left-wing bias, of a situation where these respondents are actually wanting to be more seen as more progressive than they are biblical? I think in terms of the issues we're talking about, this is troubling to me because it's consistently been Labour MPs who have pushed for abortion liberalisation, who, of course, caused abortion to be implemented in Northern Ireland. That's, again, Stella Creasy, caused the creation of these so-called buffer zones. And at the last election, included decriminalisation of abortion on their party manifesto. Now, we don't know whether this will feature in Labour's manifesto this time around. We've not seen the fine detail. I know Keir Starmer's brought out these 6 pledges or whatever. But given people like Stella Creasy, Diana Johnson continue to campaign for complete decriminalisation, are actually pushing that in this current parliament, meaning effectively abortion up to birth, that's what they want. Given that not one of the Labour shadow ministers is pro-life, given finally that Keir Starmer, while Director of Public Prosecutions, deemed it not in the public interest to prosecute a doctor carrying out sex-selective abortions, we can be pretty confident where Labour stand on this issue. We can be pretty confident what Labour wants. So are we saying either...
Just to clarify that point there. So you're referring to the fact that Keir Starmer was head of the Crown Prosecution Service before he became the Labour leader, and there was a case brought to him by Aisling Hubert on proof of sex-selective abortion following a Daily Mail sting on an abortion clinic, and Keir refused to prosecute, even though clearly they were breaching the law. Is that what you're referring to?
So he deemed it not in the public interest. So he didn't think the money that they would spend on it was really worth the time. And of course, it's a thing, it's a massive issue, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got people screaming that abortion is a women's only issue, and it's all about feminism, and it's sort of hands off our bodies, my body, my choice. Yet we know that overwhelmingly more infant girls are killed than infant boys. We know in many sort of global cultures, there's a huge preference for boys, such that in certain parts of the world, there's a huge imbalance now because this has been going on. Sex-selective abortion has been going on for so long. And we see that reflected in a microcosm in some of the kind of, in the UK, where there's large numbers from originally from overseas. So on the one hand, you've got this, well, it's all about women's rights. But on the other hand, you've got, well, if it's all about choice, actually, then why shouldn't you have the choice to kill a baby girl? That's ultimately what it boils down to. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's another issue, really. But I think my point is we kind of know where Labour are on this issue. We know from past history, we know from the people that are really pushing the pro-abortion agenda, the MPs in Parliament. We know from Keir Starmer's own background that actually, Labour is going to be a pro-abortion government, even more so than what we've got now.
Do you think this stems from the fact that people just don't understand what abortion is and what it does? I mean, I say this because I recently preached in a couple of churches, and the verse that we regularly come back to as part of a larger presentation in which we quote many Bible verses from the Old and New Testament and many from the Psalms in between, says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, ensure justice for those being crushed." And ever since my student days, I've heard this verse quoted, and it's almost, it also always has this kind of economic vibe to it. The person being crushed is the person who can't get a job. They are economically suppressed. Do you think that the majority of the Christian evangelical church that is looking like they're just going to come out and vote Labour actually understand the mechanics that in a late term abortion procedure, in order to remove the baby's head from through the cervix. At that point, it's too large and the bones are too calcified. They literally have to use a procedure that crushes the baby's head. And you know that the baby's head's been crushed because, according to Anthony Levatino, abortionist in America who did over 10,000 abortions, you see this kind of see-through what is effectively brain serum coming out of the cervix. I know this is graphic for listeners listening in, but do you think these voters are just even aware of what abortion is actually doing to human beings?
No, so I don't think they're aware. I don't think they're aware of the full horrors, Christian, and I certainly don't think they're aware of Labour's pro-abortion stance. Really, in fact, Dave Brennan tells the story of talking to not just a Labour voter, but someone who was standing for Labour, and herself didn't know in the last election what they were promising, what they were pledging vis-a-vis
Mm,
abortion,
mm,
up to birth sort of decriminalisation program, package. So I think there's huge amounts of ignorance. Yes, and one hopes as that ignorance is exposed, as people see the reality, that some of that support would, you know, if they are really going to nail their colours to the mast on this issue, that some of that support would dissipate, or indeed that people's opposition to it would see a tempering of their approach on these things. Yeah,
and so, if
it's a really important
abortion
point.
if abortion doesn't feature highly, what policies do concern the people that took this survey?
Yeah, well, this is really interesting. So there's some kind of general things. Then there was a list of specific policies. Then we'll come on to something really interesting, which is about hypothetical manifesto pledges. Okay. So in general, 58% state, and we come back to the headline at the start, that their vote is based on who will best help most others in need. Okay. So that's the quote, who will best help most others in need. And that's an encouragement, I guess, that Christians, that of evangelicals, appear to be more other oriented than just self interested.
Hmm.
So it's not just about what's going to help them, whether that's tax breaks or, I don't know, free childcare. Of course, the issue for us, really, Christian, is that I would suggest the single group most in need of help in this country are the unborn.
Hmm.
Um, but anyway, the headline: 58% say it's about helping others in need. 54%. So there was like three choices. So that's why it doesn't. The
Hmm.
percentages are more than 100. 54% state that their vote is based on biblical principles,
Hmm.
um, which initially sounds encouraging, but then you're thinking, if these are evangelicals, why is that not 100%?
Mm, mm.
but but anyway, these are the figures.
I'm with
And
you.
then 48% who will best manage the economy. So taking the top 10 issues, it goes like this from 1 to 10: economy, poverty, equality and justice, integrity and trust. 5 is Christian values. So Christian values features kind of midway through the list. Then cost of living, stroke inflation. Climate is at 7. Health and well-being, immigration, and then division and unity in the country as a whole. So that's a kind of broad brushstroke, Christian.
Okay.
But what I want to look at, what I want to spend some time on for a moment, is I think these really interesting hypothetical manifesto commitments. So what the report did is it set out some sort of hypotheticals in that if a political party included X, Y, and Z as manifesto promises, pledges,
Hmm.
whatever commitments, would that make you more likely to vote for them, or indeed less likely to vote for them? So a range of topics like single sex spaces, the living wage,
Yeah.
freedom of speech, European Convention on Human Rights, banning petrol cars, that kind of thing. And they were asked, so there was 5 boxes you could tick. So would this make you much more likely,
Yeah.
slightly more likely, no difference, sort of about the same, or
Yeah.
then on the other end of the spectrum, slightly less likely and much less likely to vote for a political party? And there was a question in this, so really relevant for us, on reducing the abortion time limit from 24 weeks.
Mm.
So if a party pledged to do that, and it was a little bit vague because it didn't say what it was going to reduce it to, but one can imagine it was perhaps mirroring Caroline Ansell's amendment to try and bring it down from 24 weeks to 22 weeks.
Mm.
Would that make you more likely to vote for them? And the data on this is that 2/3 of evangelicals, so 66%, it would make them more likely to vote for a party that promised this. And if you break that down, it's 42% would be much more likely to vote for it, and 24% would be slightly more likely to vote for it. So, in a way, that's a thumbs up, 2/3.
Mm.
But of course, the flip side of that, Christian, is that the bad news is that there were 14% who were less likely to vote for it. And that breaks down as 8% much less likely, or 8% less likely, sorry, 6% much less likely to vote for a party that promised this, with fully 1 in 5, 20%, apparently not in the slightest bit bothered either way, saying their tendency to vote for a given party or candidate would be about the same if that party or candidate pledged to lower the abortion time limit. So that's the kind of raw data. I'm sorry, there's quite a lot of statistics there, but snapshot is 2/3 would increase their likelihood to vote, but yeah, another third either would do nothing for them or would actually put them off that party, which is frankly bizarre.
Is there a possibility
that we've got a
is there a possibility that that little slither there, do you say the 12%, or do you say 14% who may be put off?
Yeah, so it's 14%, it would actually put them off. Yeah.
Okay, so is it a possibility that this 14% are full-blooded abolitionists, and they just don't, they feel like any incremental reducing of abortion is not good enough, that they actually just want the whole thing gone? Or do you think that's overly optimistic? Do you think these are ultimately pro-choice or pro-abortion individuals within the evangelical church who see any enforced protection of unborn babies in the womb as somehow going in the wrong direction?
No, I don't think these are abolitionists, Christian, at all. I think, because even as an abolitionist, I think you still go for the party that's most that has the most concern about life, even if that's a long way from where you want to be. I think what that's suggestive of, what that's reflective of, is really it. Again, it may be people who would say things like, "Well, I'd never choose an abortion for myself, but I think women should have the option, the right, and I think we shouldn't be sort of dictating at a political level or even as Christians how their choices are made." So I think that's probably what's going on there.
Interesting.
So yeah,
Let's go back upstream. Because obviously, Evangelical Alliance. Okay, what is evangelical? One of the best definitions for that comes from a guy called Babington, who came up with something called the Babington Quadrilateral, which was his kind of 4 defining points that make evangelicals, of which they are conversionalism, cross-centralism, biblicalism, and activism, right? So these are the 4 main tenets, right? And so if you look at the Clapham sect or the abolition movements, etc., and these, across the board, conversionalism, you have to be born again. That we boast only in the cross of Christ. It's only through the cross of Christ that we can be born again. That we get all of our instruction for spiritual life and inspiration for law from the Bible. And fourthly, we have to be active in a crooked and deprived generation. We have to be active in sharing our faith and transforming the culture around us, to keep out the weeds and to allow righteousness to flourish. I mean, going back to the first point, that voting biblically was what, like 5th down the list or 6th down the list, something that you highlighted earlier. I mean, that's clearly an issue. That if we're not first and foremost taking our inspiration from the scriptures, then can we conclude that some people who took this survey are not technically evangelical?
I think it's certainly it's a attenuated or impoverished understanding of what it means to be an evangelical Christian, because I think what they would argue is that, well, helping those most in need, that's the sum total of the Bible's ethical teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, yeah, that's a large part of it. but I think loving your neighbor is much broader than that. And I think loving your neighbor, one of the best ways we can love our neighbor is to create a culture, a society where biblical principles are applied across the board. And certainly we're not killing a quarter of our children in the womb. So yeah, I think there's
But this is
this
the
sort
rub,
of.
right? But this is exactly the rub, right? If you only read the New Testament and you have a feelings-based ethic of love, then you just go with the tides of what feels loving. For example, if somebody really is in a bad but non-abusive marriage and they really don't want to go there, let them go. If somebody is got pregnant outside of wedlock and it's just a fetus, let them have an abortion. It's kind of, that's the loving thing, to support them in it. But it's when you kind of read the whole of the scriptures and you understand that the shedding of innocent blood, that child sacrifice is abominable in God's eyes, that actually are the whole process of being a Christian is having God's law written on our hearts such that we don't need to be told to follow God's law. We intuitively want to follow God's law. Is when you get the whole of the Bible that you start to realize that ideas that may look or feel loving in our generation may be not at all loving according to the definitions of love laid out in the scriptures. Is that, that's, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't quite. I don't know if I may have misheard you. I don't think you could sort of quite split it down Old Testament, New Testament like that. But I agree. I think the Bible it's holistic in its way of understanding human nature, its way of understanding society, its way of encouraging what's best for us as individuals and what's best for us as community. And I think the Bible has something to say to the whole of life. So it has something to say to economic policy. It has something to say to foreign relations. It has something to say to environment and environmental issues. It certainly has something to say to the current genocide of children in our nation. And to pretend otherwise, or to say, well, we're just Christians. We don't want to impose our morality on others. So instead, we're going to just go along with the kind of secular humanist consensus, which is itself imposing a worldview on everyone. Anyway, it makes no sense to me, Christian, and I think it's a massive concern. But I think it's reflective of a lack of engagement in these things from the pulpit, from the top down, really. So I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a reflection of where the UK church, where the UK evangelical church is really on these things.
Okay, so we've looked at some of these manifesto commitments and what they expose about the priorities of Christians. Help us talk us through some more of the inconsistencies, Tim, that these questions expose. And it's worth saying we're so grateful for the EA for this. This is not a criticism of your survey. We're so grateful that you're starting to get this stuff out into the open, because now we can start addressing it. So well done, all of you who put your work into this. We did a survey a number of years ago. They are seriously hard work. So great work on this. But yeah, Tim, back to it. What are the other inconsistencies that you saw?
So 53% Christian of respondents say that they think Britain is still a Christian country, so more than half, and that its law should reflect this, which is incredible, really, and kind of bucks some of that trend of what we've just said, or hopefully does. Yet over a third seem unbothered about abortion, or actually even worse, don't want the time limit reduced. So it's like, how do we hold these things together? Even more incredible, I think, is that a massive 77% state that it is right for Christians to sometimes resist or disobey the law. Civil disobedience, we might say. And in another question, 42% agreed that Jesus will be put in jail today for his beliefs and actions. Okay. And I actually think that's pretty much, that's a sound reflection of the New Testament. That's sound theology. We talk about Acts 5:29. It's more important to obey God than human authority. The preference is to obey both, but where they're in conflict, you always choose God rather than human authority. But how does that cash out? If we've got all these Christians, fired up, yep, I'm ready to go to jail, I'm ready to disobey the government, to disobey the law. What does that cash out for them? Are we talking about Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion here? These massive figures, 77%, Well, they're certainly not outside abortion centers getting arrested with the Catholics, are they?
Mm.
So what are they doing? Where are they? What does this mean? What does this kind of these these sort of high principles? It's big talk, isn't it? But where do we see people walking the walk? I think the other thing to say is the other thing the report revealed is there's massive sort of lack of trust actually in the political system and political parties. So 62% of respondents do not trust politicians. 64% felt the current political parties actually discouraged engagement, and 39% did not feel hopeful for the country's future. So it's quite bleak. And yet, this is where the inconsistency is. 70% of them are still going to vote for Labour or Tory anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so it's like, well, the situation's a mess, but we're going to just keep doing the status quo. In fact, we're going to do the status quo even more and hope for change. So there's
There's,
this sort of general wariness, suspicion, but the dots are not being joined, and particularly the dots are not being joined, Christian, on what is an aggressively pro-abortion Labour Party in its current manifestation. I'm not saying can't change, but in its current policies and manifestation, this is a pro-abortion Labour Party, and yet these are the people we want to return to, or we want not to return, but we want to put into power for another 5 years. These are who are evangelicals going to vote for. It's
so
desperate.
in short, if you don't trust them, don't vote for them. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, if how can you say you don't trust the political kind of the political kind of arrangement we've got currently? We're not hopeful for the country's future, but yet our way out of that or our response to that is just to vote for the same people. It's the definition of insanity, isn't it? It keeps
Well, I
doing
was
the same thing and expecting change.
Well, I was gonna say, use metaphors of, hopping on a boat or in a car and you didn't quite trust it. Would you still do it? Or maybe getting a vaccine, you didn't trust it, but would you still do it? The only problem is human nature shows that we do all those things all the
We do,
time.
yes.
So maybe what is needed here is just more principle in terms of if you don't trust something, go individually, understand what your candidate believes, and find a candidate that you can, you know, in conscience vote for, and you can give an account for that vote when you stand before the Lord at the end of time. Now, those are two inconsistencies you mentioned there, Tim. You mentioned another inconsistency about foreign aid when we were speaking off record. What's the inconsistency with foreign aid?
Yeah, so one of these hypothetical manifesto pledges was about increasing or restoring the government's percentage to overseas aid to its what it originally was some years ago of 0.7% of GDP. So slightly more evangelicals would vote for a party based on that change than would vote for the abortion limit being reduced. Um, Now, the irony of that is, I think that we think, oh, overseas aid, that's great, helping those in need, helping those in absolute poverty.
Hmm.
In reality, that's not really what this aid goes towards. In fact, huge amounts of aid are funneled to pro-abortion agencies like International Planned Parenthood and are involved in setting up abortion centers and abortion propaganda for countries, for people that largely don't want it and certainly haven't asked for it. So, um, again, it's something just we need to be aware of. And I think it's another example of kind of scratching beneath the surface, following the money, asking what actually are these policies all about? It sounds
Hmm.
great, doesn't it? Overseas aid, 0.7% GDP. But what is that money going towards? What are we kind of doing with it? What are we supporting? And I think if with all these things, if people can really drill down, can look at policy pledges when they come out in full, that would be a good thing.
Tragic. I think you're right. We have to scratch beneath the surface. We just more questions need to be asked. I was struck. There's a book out there, isn't there? It's something along the lines of the 300 and something questions that Jesus asked, and the one he answered. You know, which is we need to learn the art of asking the good questions to expose what's really going on. And just not going with just the slogans or just the feelings. Um, so I think that's really, really helpful. Now, the report has a helpful section on what the church is saying about politics. Can you comment a bit on that, Tim? Because obviously this is very relevant. One of the things that Brephos does is we come and speak in churches. We'd love to come and speak in your churches on the issue of abortion, and we basically do it all for you. It's a bit like Mr. Muscle. We do the hard work so that you don't have to, as we address the abortion genocide with truth and love, not condemning, but certainly exposing, so that people can come to a genuine place of healing and repentance on abortion. But what did this report say about the pulpit?
So, in terms of things that have been talked about in the church, sort of from the front in the last year, there's a list of these things, and I'm not going to go through all the percentages, but just at a high of 67%. So the first thing, the most common thing talked about was poverty in the UK. And again, we might not be surprised by that. That may be largely understandable. I think it's important. I would say it's perhaps not the thing of this moment. I think poverty in the UK is a serious issue. I'm not sure it's killing people, certainly not in the way abortion is. But poverty in the UK was top. Then I'm gonna rattle through a few of these, Christians. So war and peace next, and that's probably a reflection on the situation in Ukraine, I would imagine. Then international poverty, international religious freedom and persecution next. Children and families, marriage, refugees, stroke asylum seekers, climate change. So climate change isn't top. That encouraged me, but climate change is in there. Young people, gender identity, housing and homelessness, religious freedom in the UK, local issues, which is very broad. I mean, that's not specified. I guess it could be anything from road congestion to, graffiti, litter in the local park. Then human trafficking and slavery, then racism, then education, and then, drum roll please, in 17th place, abortion. And 21% actually said they'd heard something from the church on abortion in the last year. So only 1 in 5 evangelical churches mentioning this. And to be honest, Christian, based on our kind of anecdotal evidence, I was quite surprised it was even this high. So it's been talked about to some extent, yet it's clearly what that statistic says. It's not on the radar of nearly 80%, so 4/5 of evangelical churches in any meaningful way in the last year. It's never been mentioned, never been touched upon. No one's ever asked anyone to sign a petition. So the greatest injustice of this country, of this generation, the greatest injustice ever, frankly, is not being talked about by the vast majority of evangelical churches in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, that pause for thought there, isn't it? 250,000 unborn lives taken per year, 10 million lives killed since 1967, and ranked 17th on kind of ethical concerns for churches, from the pulpit. And also, the other thing is just not seeing the links between these things. I mean, on a macro spiritual level, God hates the shedding of innocent blood. When Israel sacrificed their children, he says he abhorred his inheritance. And the history of Israel says that what happened next is the Babylonians invaded, then later on the Syrians invaded, and so we see clearly from Old Testament history that the shedding of innocent blood affects the prosperity of a nation, something that I think in the church we're very, very reticent to heed. And also just even going up to kind of marriage, I remember sitting in the O2, paid for tickets to watch Jordan Peterson, talking about marriage and how we have to, we start with ourselves. That's where we got to start, and I just really struck by just the it starts in the home, war and peace, poverty, these things are so related to the home, and if you are having children out of wedlock that you don't want and then they are being killed, that has all kinds of consequences on the stability of your home, especially if this stuff is not repented of, and I mean, I can think of 2 examples of people, their lives being destroyed: depression, suicide, self-harm, addiction, etc. Addiction coming right at the bottom of this list. And then, or the other end of the spectrum, people going on to lead very illustrious careers, and addicted to work and progress, etc. But because they've made that sacrifice earlier on, but it wasn't a sacrifice of themselves, it was a sacrifice of others for themselves. So there's all lots of interconnectivity. I think it goes back to the point you were making earlier about just the wholeness of the scriptures and dealing with the wholeness of the issue, and just seeing the it's ultimately sin. It's in our church we regularly talk about sin being shove off God, I'm in charge, not you. But it's the nature of the consequence of sin, rejecting God, doing it our own way, and it's just mess after mess, and it's all interconnected mess, that the gospel speaks into if we just dare to apply it.
Absolutely. And the irony is that, so another one of these questions and responses was about, Christians wanting, evangelicals wanting a bit more political involvement. So 70% or whatever say they want the church to be more involved in politics. But it's like church leaders there doesn't seem to be much appetite for this kind of engagement from the church leadership, and that they're rarely touching on specific policies, specific issues from the pulpit. And when they do, they're kind of pretty bland, or no one sort of who isn't sort of against poverty or whatever. But only 13% of church leaders in the last year have openly encouraged their members to support or oppose a particular political policy. So Christians want pastors to preach on political issues more than pastors appear willing to. And when topical issues are mentioned, you're more than twice as likely to hear about climate change as you are about abortion. So what do we, how do we respond to this? I mean, I think, as we've alluded to, we've clearly, and this is not the big bad world outside. This is ourselves. This is close to home. This is, our own evangelical churches. We've clearly swallowed too much of the mainstream secular narrative on what counts as compassion, other-centered kindness. So things like climate change are in. But hard countercultural teaching on sexuality, on abortion is out. And as we've frequently seen, even among evangelicals, abortion, when it is presented, it's often seen still through this lens of it's a woman's issue. It's best addressed only by women. We saw that with the Keswick Convention last year. How do we change the narrative? And there are good resources, and Evangelical Alliance partnered particularly with the Evangelical Alliance kind of in Northern Ireland, when Northern Ireland were going through these issues on abortion, with the Both Lives Matter campaign, which was essentially does what it says on the tin, holding up the value of both the life of the pregnant mother and the life of the unborn child. We need to break this narrative that abortion is about healthcare, reproductive rights. It's not. Abortion is about child sacrifice, as you said, Christian, so clearly, the shedding of innocent blood, and that cannot fail to affect those who make that decision, both the men and the women. This is not a neutral healthcare choice like having your appendix out. This is a value-loaded ethical decision that involves killing our own offspring. Children's lives are at stake. And if we claim, going back to the headline right at the start, if we claim to care about the vulnerable, about the marginalized, about helping those in need, that was the big headline, then how can we be silent? How can we be silent about the wholesale destruction of infants in the womb? And as you said, I would encourage, if you are keen to see more political engagement in your church, I would say encourage your pastor, your church leader, your minister, your elders to speak on this issue, to speak out. Invite a Brephos speaker. We can do it for you to some extent. Examine the political manifestos when they're published of these political parties, especially as they pertain to this issue of abortion.
Or if you're one of the Labour voters who did this survey, and maybe you're listening into this podcast, visit www.abortionreality.com and just see for yourself what abortion really is. Because I think once you see abortion for what it really is, everything changes, and you suddenly realize that this is a person who has been dehumanized, and you suddenly realize that being a person, we've got to adopt policies that look after them. And so I encourage you to do that. We trust that the reason why people are currently thinking and voting the way they are is just because they're ignorant. They're ignorant on what abortion's doing. They're ignorant on what the scriptures say. And that is something that we are so committed to helping you on to help you bring you up to speed, and to just realize, start to see this issue the way God sees it. And as we often say, this is not a matter of left and right. This is a matter of right and wrong. It's actually the axis here is far more up, down, God and us, than it is what side of the political spectrum we're on. We thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Tim, thank you so much for helping guide us through this important document. Link to the document also below. Any final comments?
No, I think I would certainly encourage people to actually look at it themselves. I would also want to say, yeah, we are not endorsing ourselves any one party. I think it's important to say. I think it's important to say that a lot of the recent kind of pro-abortion sort of legislation, it may not have originated with the Tories, but it's gone through under their watch. So we're certainly not giving them a free ride either. And I think if perhaps Conservatives had voted in certain ways when there was free votes differently, certainly I think on the buffer zones things would have been different. So I think it's a massive blind spot for all the major political parties. I think I want to say that, but I would say certainly from past experience and current experience, the most aggressively pro-abortion party that are likely to get elected. I'm not saying they're worse than. I'm not saying they're worse than the Greens or anyone else, but who are likely to get elected is in its current manifestation the Labour Party. So I think do your research and challenge individual candidates, challenge sitting MPs. Do they agree with this stuff? If not, let's get it out of Labour manifestos, Labour policy.
Amazing. There you have it. Do your research. Search the scriptures. See what abortion really is, and read those manifestos. Ask the questions like Jesus did. And God bless you. We look forward to sharing more facts and figures, commentary, and reality with you on the Brephos podcast next week.